Good morning, Breakfast with Bacon fans. I am Dr. Christine Bacon, and I'm here today with a new friend, right, Father? You're going to be my new friend.
Sounds good.
I had actually had Father Paul Sullins on the air, and I was talking to him. I said, I'd love to do a show on celibacy. Would you like to do it with me? And he said, I've got someone even better for you. So he introduced me to Father Griffin Carter, right?
Carter Griffin.
Griffin.
It's a little confusing.
Well, because you get two first names, right? And because you are the author of a book called Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest, which I just love. Celibacy and fatherhood are like paradox, unless you use it in this term. So this is just an exciting idea for me because I love the idea of the priesthood. Father, I have 6 grandchildren and 5 of them are boys. And I have actually asked the Lord to give me a minimum of 1, but I would love to have all 5 of them be priests. I think the world needs good priests. My daughter's like, what? I'm like, look, you can go to Isabel's wedding. That'll be fine. But,
Yeah, I wish more grandparents did that. And a lot do, actually.
Well, I'm doing it more, and I'm doing it with this. I'm
Amen.
learning. Let's just do this. This is a little rabbit trail. For the first time in my life, I've gone to a Latin mass. Have you performed or gone to a Latin mass? Okay, well, I was like, well, pretty awesome. But St. Benedict's down here has this sign, this big picture in there when you first walk in. I forgot what that's called. The narthex. The narthex. The new phraseology's got me messed up on stuff. They have this big sign of a parish in, I think it was Loo, Italy, where they had the families made a concerted effort to pray for vocations for those children in that parish. And you know what? They had 623 of their children that became nuns and priests. And so they had a reunion like 30, 40 years later. And you see all these.
Wow.
And so that church has got these prayer cards out for fathers, for mothers, and I think for grandparents to pray for the vocations for their children, grandchildren, and then for that parish specifically. It's not my parish. I go there because they have a good 6 a.m. mass. But I thought, you know what? I'll ask you this. I'm going to start the show before I even give your intro. Could there be a greater vocation than giving your whole life to the God of the universe?
Well, I mean, I think the right answer is the greatest vocation is the one that God called us to, right? And so in that sense, but you're right, that in just objectively speaking, if you just look at it apart from actual individuals and individual callings, I certainly find the priestly vocation to be one that I'm so honored to be called to, and it's an exceptionally beautiful vocation. I mean, every sort of flower in God's garden is a beautiful flower, and every vocation is a beautiful vocation, but there is something exceptionally powerful about being associated with Jesus and being conformed to his priesthood in such a way that you can really kind of give yourself to his people, as you said, with a completely undivided heart in celibacy, and being invited into this sacramental mystery of the Eucharist and all of the sacraments and serving people in that way. So yeah, no, I'm a little bit prejudiced, but I certainly love the vocation of priesthood.
Oh, well, I've been a cradle Catholic, so I'm 55 years old, and I've always loved my faith. I've always believed in transubstantiation, though right now 70% of practicing Catholics don't. We need to do a better job of that. But recently, if you could put your hands up like that, could you put your hands up so we can see them in the camera? I think about those hands. Right there. Those hands are the only ones capable of turning bread and wine to God. Yeah. I mean, so as a priest, I wonder, do you ever look at your hands and think, what power God has put into these hands?
No, it's incredibly humbling. I mean, the whole thing is humbling. Being able to forgive sins, being able to conduct the Eucharist, being able to anoint the sick before they go to the Lord. I mean, there's just the privilege of the priesthood is something that you never really get tired of it. I mean, I suppose we're all capable of experiencing anything as routine, even something as routine as the beauty of the priesthood. But I think that's part of our job. All of our jobs is really to kind of not allow the vocation, the path that we've been put on by the Lord to become routine to us. We always are conscious of what's happening.
Yeah, as evil as COVID and all that has been, God used that that lapse, that void of not allowing me to go to mass. I know you were able to. I got to stop saying perform mass because I forgot what it's called.
Celebrate mass.
Celebrate,
offer the mass. Yeah.
You'd never guess that I was a cradle Catholic, right? But until I was without mass for an extended period, I was like, God, I am so sorry for taking you for granted in a way that I wasn't even aware of, since my first communion. So, when the time came, I said, Lord, help me never to take this for granted again. Though, again, I've been back to church for 2 months now, May, June, July. And I do forget sometimes. I'm like, geez, how ditzy are you of a blonde? You promise you'll never take it for granted, and then you do it again.
And he knows, as the scriptures say, he knows what men are made of, and so he knows who we are. And I think he doesn't, he's not a taskmaster looking for us to kind of constantly, receive as if it were the first time. But I think he also sees into our hearts and sees if we want to receive, as if for the first time. There's a beautiful thing in the Missionaries of Charity and their sacristies. Says, priest of God, offer this mass as if it were your first mass, your last mass, and your only mass. And we all can fail to do that. We all do fail to do that sometimes, and the Lord knows that. But I think he sees into our hearts, and he knows if we're making the effort. And I think that's true for receiving communion, going to confession. I mean, even just reading the scriptures. We take for granted the beauty of having this inspired word of God as text, and we have a handful of Bibles scattered around the house, and we could take it all for granted. We could take him for granted. But I mean, you also know, having children and grandchildren, that children take their parents and their grandparents for granted, and we don't hold it against them. I say, like, you're a naughty boy for having forgotten how good I've been to you for the last 12 years. I mean, no one thinks that way.
Right.
And certainly if we don't think that way about our children, then nor does our good Father in heaven.
Well, praise him for that, I swear. Well, let me give an intro. Let me put these back on and tell my viewers who you are. I'm going to be a little formal here. So Father Carter Griffin's a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., so a little north of me. I'll come visit you sometime. You were raised a Presbyterian, but he converted to Catholicism while attending Princeton. So one of those typical underachievers, right? After graduating in '94, he served 4 years on the surface fleet of the United States Navy and what aircraft carriers, right? Was it?
No, a cruiser and a destroyer.
Cruisers. Which one? Which one?
The USS Vella was the cruiser. And
that was my ship. Okay,
really?
Keep going. Yeah.
And then the USS Mooseburger was the destroyer that I was on.
Were you stationed here in Norfolk then? Because that's where Vella Gulf is out of.
I was in Norfolk and then in Mayport, Florida, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. I worked at the Fleet and Family Support Center, so we were given a ship or two. Well, I had 7. Yeah, and I rode the Vella Gulf back and forth, and I trained all their people in the return and reunion, if you remember what those were.
Yeah, sure.
They're the ones that actually got the pirates.
Oh, that's right. We were actually, I was on there right after she was commissioned. She was commissioned in, I guess it was early '95, and I got there in sort of mid '95. So I was still with the kind of the whole plank owner crew and everything like that.
Right. That's
yeah,
exciting.
It was fun. It was a great
ship.
4 years.
I love her. It was a great ship.
She's a great ship, yeah.
So let me see, where did I leave off? After you attended Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland for 2 years, let's see, you went to the North American College in Rome for 5 years of theology. You were ordained into the priesthood in 2004. And let me see, you got doctoral studies in Rome. Again, underachiever. It's pretty exciting. I like this kind of stuff. And your doctoral dissertation was entitled Supernatural Fatherhood Through Priestly Celibacy, Fulfillment in Masculinity. Oh, that's so rich, because masculinity has been attacked, fatherhood has been attacked, the priesthood has been attacked, and celibacy has been attacked.
That's right.
So let's just go right there. Enough of any kind of wasted time. Tell me, Father, what caused you to write this book?
Well, actually, it's a very interesting story, because my original thought of going, when I went to Rome, I had a completely different idea in mind. I really wanted to kind of get the doctorate done in just a couple of years if I could, and get back home, because I was still fairly newly ordained, and I really wanted to get back in the saddle and get to a parish. So I had some other ideas in mind. Those were starting to fall through as I got to Rome. So I talked to a priest friend of mine who, and this was right after Pope Benedict was elected. So Pope Benedict XVI was elected not long before. I got there in 2008. So I guess he was elected, a few years after, I guess he started. And I talked to this priest friend of mine who had worked with him at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for a number of years. So he knew now Pope Benedict very well. And I said, I called him up and I said, I'm having a hard time finding a topic and a director. He says, if I were to ask the Pope right now, what would he want me to write a dissertation on? He said, what do you think he would say? And this priest friend of mine came back to me and he said immediately, he says, the theology of celibacy, without hesitating. which I found fascinating because, I mean, it's sort of like it seemed like a random topic at the time. I think in hindsight, we see just how prescient it was of the Holy Father to know that this was on the horizon. And so anyway, that was kind of the general sort of nudge. And then I talked to someone else, and anyway, one thing led to another. And there had been a philosophy dissertation written shortly before I got there, finished short before I got there. And it was on fatherhood as being the fulfillment of masculinity, not looking at priesthood or celibacy, but just fatherhood itself.
Like biological fatherhood?
So, well, yes, but also opening up to other sort of natural other ways of giving life. They're not biological, including adopting children, but also, you know, those who have not married but are giving their lives for the sake of others, really building others up in other ways. These are sort of, he's sort of expanding out the idea of fatherhood from biological to these other ways. And so really mine was sort of the theological continuation of that idea. By the way, almost all these ideas have their parallel with women. You know, that really motherhood is in a sense the fulfillment of femininity, which again, may be biological, may not be biological, but for someone to be non-life-giving, not mother, not father, means to be sterile. And there's a lack of fulfillment of who we're intended to be as men and women. And so finding really in some ways, I think, this is getting off track now, but I mean, finding how we are supposed to be a mother or a father is kind of a sign of the maturity, of real maturity, human maturity, and then I think also Christian maturity. John Paul II actually says this somewhere, where he talks about a sign of spiritual maturity is giving life in the order of grace, right? And that's kind of a paraphrase, but anyway, so the continuation of that philosophical idea of fatherhood being the fulfillment of masculinity was the question, well, what kind of fatherhood do priests have? And especially what kind of fatherhood do celibate priests have? And looking at the role of celibacy in the life of a priest. And so the fundamental idea of the dissertation was to say that celibacy, as you said at the beginning, you know, sounds like a contradiction. Celibacy and fatherhood are opposite things, right? You're either a father or you're celibate. Yeah. But in fact, I think at a deeper level, we see that celibacy is not only a way of opening up a different kind of fatherhood, a spiritual fatherhood in the order of grace, but actually contributes to it. It enables us to live in a unique way, spiritual fatherhood, that a married priest, and of course we have married priests, we know that. You were talking to Father
Paul Solomons,
you know? Yeah, right, and there are many wonderful men who are married and who are priests, but that celibacy opens up this space in a sort of a privileged way of living spiritual fatherhood, which is why I think the instincts of the people of God for celibacy are so strong. And by the way, you asked why why I did the dissertation. Well, the reason, so the book is kind of a follow-up and sort of a, simplifying and kind of that thing of the dissertation and adding some other things. But one of the reasons for writing the book, what was that? I guess 8 years later or something like that, was because, you know, in the midst of this second wave of scandals, I think that there were a lot of people in the 2018 wave with the McCarrick issue and all these other things. I was in the seminary in 2002, was sort of the first wave, you know, and I remember talking to a lot of people.
Yourself.
Yeah, and a lot of people were, a lot of people who were not necessarily the most faithful Catholics were sort of taking everything to task and saying celibacy was a problem. But the people who were, you know, the really faithful Catholics, I mean, there was no question about celibacy still at that time.
Right.
But what I found in conversations, maybe anecdotally, but I think more than that, in the 2018 was that the best Catholics were starting to question celibacy. You know, that they were saying maybe the problem is that, you know, and maybe if we just had married priests, then we wouldn't have all of these headaches. Then I would stop. Then I would no longer be ashamed of being a Catholic when I go to work, you know.
Which is really funny. Can you hold that thought? What's really funny is that even the secular world, my PhD is in communication, but I taught sexual assault awareness class, the savvy classes in the military and domestic violence. And one of the things even secularist, ungodly people understand is that sexual abuse has little to do with sex, with celibacy and lack of sex. I mean, children are molested and sexualized constantly, and they have spouses, they are married, they have access to having sex with, you know, a healthy heterosexual sex. And so it always shocks me, which to me it's kind of more diabolical than to try to say, oh, well, if you allowed them to have sex, all of these negative desires would disappear, which is just so untrue.
No, I think that's right. And I think it's really kind of, there is an underlying assumption that has guided and driven much of the sexual revolution, actually, which is an understanding of human sexuality, which is simply a distortion of the truth,
Yeah,
and
it's
it's
just
and
an
it's this idea that,
objectification.
I mean, that for all of human history, there have been people who have given up marriage for other goods, even human goods. The ones who gives up, the famous spinster aunt kind of thing, giving up marriage to take care of her parents. I mean, this is something that many, many people have done through history. The Oxford Dons, in the educational world, and you know, and so the idea that we're sort of become these repressed, bundles of sexual energy that are going to explode in all these unhealthy ways it's a false anthropology. There's simply no science behind it whatsoever. I mean, the most vicious sexual predators, as you said, are married people. They tend to be stepfathers, I mean, and any priest knows that here, in terms
Right.
of child abuse. And, when we're talking about sexual infidelity, I mean, unfortunately, adultery and fornication are veritable epidemics today,
Right.
and so
Right.
the idea that, we'll just get them off married, and then it's a pretty low view of marriage, which is another thing. It's like, we'll just get them married off, and then we will no longer have these sexual problems. I mean, as if that's what marriage is. It's
Yeah.
not a cure for, not having good formation and not being faithful to your vows, whether those vows are in marriage or if they're in celibacy. Anyway, I think all those things kind of came together, and there are a lot of people who were starting to really question the wisdom of celibacy, and that really hurt me a lot, because I really have come to a profound, deep love for celibacy. And that's as a convert. I remember before I became Catholic, I remember somebody saying, well, maybe you'll be a priest one day. And I priested, and I was really, I mean, first of all, I was shocked. I was a little bit offended. I was like, I didn't want anything to do with this. I planned to get married. I had a very serious girlfriend. I mean, all these things.
Right.
And so I was not raised to kind of understand celibacy. I came to it later. But having, first of all, come to an appreciation of it, and then a kind of a scriptural and a theological understanding of it, and now, most importantly, like living it. I mean, I really do see that when it's lived with fidelity and with love, and with, you try to be generous. Of course, we're all, we all fail, as you said earlier. We're all kind of struggling on that journey, but there's a lot of joy in this vocation. It's a beautiful vocation that really opens up a very rich web of human contacts. I mean, very few people have as much contact with as many people as a priest does, at such an intimate and deep way.
Exactly.
And so, are there lonely priests? Absolutely. There are
And
also a
there's
lot of very
lonely married couples. I mean, that's
married
what I do
people
for
out
a
there.
living.
I know. So anyway, all of that kind of came together, and it's sort of like that determination to try to put something together that might be helpful for people to understand a little bit better about celibacy.
Well, I thank you for that explanation, because my daughters were raised by me, cradle Catholics, put them in Catholic school, and, done their little journeys away. And, now they have to find God in their own ways. They still call themselves Catholic. That's not
Sure.
but, when I was telling my daughter, I'd love for one of your sons or more to be priest, she's like, they can get married and still worship God. And so what's the advantage? And one of the things
Right.
that's really been coming to me more and more clearly is that who wants the average, right? Who settles for the average? Let me make my point here. When I was a little girl, priests were like mini gods, right? I mean, we looked at priests like, you're the representative of God. So it was always Father Janiak or Father, Shibelinski. I'm Polish, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's Father that. And then as it was maturing, it was Father Bob, Father Joe, and so what I saw is this kind of like watering down of, we're just the everyman, which of course probably came with Vatican II, going, instead of worshiping God, let's just make it all about the people. Again, something I didn't understand until as I'm maturing. But I realized is that if you can have anything, why do you go after it? Especially the male. I don't know if you know me, but I wrote the book, The Super Couple, A Formula for Extreme Happiness. I'm a marriage person. And what I've studied, male and female brain, the male is wired for provision, protection, for challenge, for accomplishment. And when we say nothing's an effort, just go, the male loses his ambition or desire, or what's the point? Where's my need? So getting to celibacy, if I can be married and I can be a priest and anybody can do this, and again, no messing with the Novus Ordo. I take communion in the hands and stuff, but thinking, well, anybody can touch the host. Why would I want to be a priest? But when you say, no, you're held to this standard. And are you strong enough to be celibate? Are you strong enough to give your life for this community of people instead of just being a married man. Like, I don't know, what is it, 90 some percent of our males are married, and only, what, I don't know the numbers, 1 or 2% are priests.
Mm-hmm.
So the point I'm trying to make is, if we remind ourselves, yes, this is, when you enter this beautiful vocation, sure, there will be sacrifices, but are you man enough? If that, I don't want that to sound pejorative, are you strong enough? Can you give that to God to sacrifice something for this vocation? Does that make sense? And if I've spoken in any way that's kind of errant of my Catholic knowledge, please correct it.
Yeah, no, I think certainly that's the sacrificial dimension of celibacy that you're talking about is absolutely part of it. And in some ways, it was kind of the initial instinct of the early Christians, you know, who embraced celibacy in many cases, or certainly more commonly at the very beginning was continence within marriage. That part of it had there's a liturgical aspect to it, you know, going back deep into the Old Testament about sort of ritual purification before offering the sacrifice, and that was kind of in there. But there was also the sense, especially as the centuries went on, in the early, you know, after the martyrdoms were really over, that there were many who said that celibacy and virginity, in a way, became a kind of immolation of self, a kind of death to self, a kind of sacrifice of self for the sake of God, the undivided heart that St. Paul talks about in Corinthians, as well as service to their brothers and sisters, to their neighbors. And so that sort of dying to self for the sake of the greater good there is a sacrificial dimension to it. In fact, I think it's so important that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why those for whom celibacy is not a sacrifice, for example, those who are not attracted to women and wouldn't get married anyway, one of the reasons why those individuals shouldn't be ordained is because there isn't a sacrifice, and that is an essential component.
Yeah.
So it's not the reason for the celibacy per se, you know. I mean, I think that those are important aspects to it. I mean, I think the fundamental reason is because it does open our heart in a unique way to serving people as priests. But that interior death to self is a really important part of the charism of celibacy, which is why not everyone is called to it. I mean, and our Lord says it, you know, even when he's talking about eunuchs, you know, the eunuchs who are born that way, eunuchs who are made that way by man, and eunuchs who choose this, you know, for the sake of the kingdom of God. And he says that not everyone has that, you know, but to those to whom it is given, it becomes this tremendous grace for them and for others. So yeah, the sacrifice is certainly there. I also think that celibacy has a very beautiful positive dimension in terms of opening, especially to spiritual fatherhood, you know. And I think, you know, kind of on another level, celibacy is also a very powerful way of imitating Christ's own priesthood, right? That his priesthood, that obviously he was celibate, and he was not celibate because he couldn't get married. You know, I mean, again, it's a very dim vision of marriage that would suggest that Jesus, who is a perfect man, couldn't get married. Of course he could have, but there were good reasons why he didn't. Very good reasons, you know, and several of them. But, you know, the point is that to sort of, to make that same sacrifice that he made, and to live his priesthood as he was, with a kind of a radical freedom to be able to go anywhere his Father asked him, you know, to go, is I think a particularly it's a particularly close representation of Christ. It's not necessary in a strict sense. There are married priests, as we talked about earlier, but it is, I think, in some sense, it is essential, or it is part of the priesthood itself, because there's only one priesthood, as we know, and the priesthood is that of Jesus Christ.
Right.
And all of us share in that. And that one priesthood of Jesus Christ is, like Hebrews says, and according to the order of Melchizedek, it's one without ancestry. It's one who comes, and he is, in a sense, a man completely for others without those particular claims of marriage and immediate family. So yeah, there's a sacrifice involved in it. I think that sacrifice is essential. And I think as long as we also keep in mind the sort of the positive dimensions of celibacy, and both of those together, yeah, then I think we have a full picture of it.
Because even Father Paul Sullins, who is a married priest, and for those who are watching, because I have Protestants that watch as well, married priests in the Catholic are those who were already married and priests in other churches like the Episcopalian faith, which Father Paul was,
right,
who converted to Catholicism. And so they said, well, we're not going to forbid you from the priesthood just because you're married. So in those cases, they get to take their wife. And even he said, and he's got a very happy marriage.
Yeah.
He goes, no, I am pro celibacy. I believe in the value of that. And Father Monsignor Mike McCarran, who was my pastor for many years, said, you know, when this is on a very natural level, not the supernatural level, he said, when a father's child gets sick or has soccer games or whatever, I have to be a father and I have to go be there for that child. Or what if,
Definitely.
you know, I get transferred on my child's senior year, then I'm torn between keeping that kid there or whatever. He said, but when I am not married and the church is my family and I get to father them, I can pick up at 2 a.m. You have a sick person, do the, you know, the last rites or
Yeah.
whatever, be there for a grieving widow. So on the natural level, both of those men were pointing to, no, there's a focus. But
Yeah.
as you just pointed out, the strength of.
And to take it one step further, not only is it, I think, a matter of kind of time, like chronological time, the amount of time I have to serve my family versus, and, you know, that divided heart there. I think that is true. But I think at an even deeper level, there's a sort of an emotional and psychological and spiritual openness to people that is different in the celibate than the man who is married. And it's supposed to be. I mean, when I was a boy and I would go, and I remember sometimes visiting, we moved around a lot, but when I was visiting our pastor, I mean, I didn't come first in his life. No one thought I did. I didn't. You know, he didn't. He had a family. He had children. You know, and obviously they came first in his life. You know,
Right.
I mean, I was not his primary focus, and nor should I have been. That would have been
Right.
that would have been an incorrect ordering in the order of charity. But for a priest, that's not the case. When somebody comes to us as a celibate priest, they know and we know that they, in a sense, come first in our life because we have no one who takes precedence over that. Now, there may be like my parishioners versus, you know, others, and there's going to be still an ordering of charity, but it's a very different one than like the immediacy of the claims of an immediate family, which is a beautiful claim and it's a very noble claim, but it's one that can be difficult to live with the priesthood.
Can you clarify something that most people watching probably don't know, because I didn't know it until about a year ago?
Sure.
You don't just take a vow of celibacy. You mentioned continence as well. So you take 3 vows, right? Chastity, continence, and celibacy, correct, right?
Well, I guess
And
there are a
then
couple
what are
things
the
there.
3 of them?
First of all, they're not vows, strictly speaking, for diocesan priests. They're promises, but they have the same force in a sense of vows. There's some theological differences. So the traditional vows that religious priests would make, or religious would make, men and women, and also religious priests, would be poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so those are the 3 vows. And in a sense, all of those have their parallels in the diocesan priesthood, in the secular priesthood, which are most parish priests. And there are promises, which are, you know, the promise of obedience is very clear. The promise of poverty is not the same. It's more of a simplicity, kind of a promise to live a simple life. But we don't have the same, you know, we're allowed to own things and to have a car and, you know, to have a bank account, stuff like that. So it's not the same thing as a vow. And then the promise of celibacy. So celibacy is, yeah, the promise of not getting married, and but celibacy and all of those presume the same thing that is true for all Christians, which is, in fact, all people, according to natural law, which is chastity. So chastity and continence are something that are needed for all Christians, for all of us. Continence is kind of the lower level of it. It's basically the capacity not to sin. Right? So continence, if somebody is continent in the sexual sense, then we say that they are able to exercise their sexual faculty or not, as they choose. But it's not something that is yet at the level of a virtue. And the virtue of chastity is one in which it's really kind of the virtue of self-command, in which, and the virtue means that we're able to live that virtue, holy purity, with ease, with facility. In other words, you probably, when you walk into the store, don't have to fight off the temptation to steal Snickers bars. You know, you have the virtue.
I don't know.
Let me choose a different example. No, so you go in there, and it's not like you're kind of constantly worried about it, and you get out as quickly as you can because you might steal something.
Right.
You know, because you have the virtue. It's like easy to do. It's easy not to steal. Right. So that's called the virtue, versus the person who's just overcoming, you know, that temptation. And it's like, I have to really move quickly. I have to be with somebody because otherwise I might try to steal something. You know what I mean? So we can see the difference between continence.
For instance. Yeah.
It's kind of like that, although it's not a mental illness. It's just ordinary sin. Right. And so when somebody really struggles to just live the church's teachings and not commit sin, they're still striving for continence. But then the next level, and we certainly want this before somebody is ordained to the priesthood.
So hold on, continence. So that's like the married man striving to just.
A married man should be chaste as well. I mean, really, all Christians.
Well, but you're talking continence.
Right. So continence is kind of, in a sense, it's just the state of not committing this sin. Right. I'm sort of simplifying here, but I mean, continence is really, okay, if I'm continent, I'm able to not sin. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. but
So
it's
I'm
much
not having
better.
sex with women outside of marriage.
For example, right? And yeah,
Okay.
not looking
I
at
need
pornography,
examples. Okay.
not looking at pornography, or not looking
Okay.
at, all these kinds of things, right? These would be, continence is like just avoiding something, avoiding the sin. And,
Okay.
and then chastity is when we live a life in which we are in command of ourselves, and we live chastity, and God's grace helps us to do this, where we no longer have to kind of constantly sort of, there's still going to be
Avoid.
temptations, but I mean, it's easy to kind of not give into them, just as you might be tempted to steal a Snickers bar, but it doesn't even occur to you to really take it seriously.
Right.
And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that very peaceful approach to sexuality, which every man and woman, every Christian
Needs
should
to
have.
do anyway.
Yeah, because a married person needs to have that sort of freedom of heart, that capacity to give themselves, which is chastity, just as much as a priest does. So yeah, that would be something that wouldn't be a specific promise of the priesthood, because that's really part of our Christian vocation.
And then celibacy simply means not marrying, right?
Right. So that's, strictly speaking, celibacy just means not getting married. And so really what what I think Pope Benedict was getting at was that, there are a lot of books out there about the psychology of celibacy and the history of it and the canon law of it and, all these different things, but not as many things out there to help us appreciate that at a deeper level, how is celibacy more than just not getting married? In other words, why do we have celibacy? And that really is, I think, that's the attempt of the book that I wrote, is the attempt of some other thinkers through time, but there hasn't been as much of that as maybe would be good, so that we really have a deeper sense of why we're doing this.
Okay. Well, in your book, you question optional celibacy. You have some pitfalls of celibate paternity. What are those?
I wrote the thing. I didn't mean I have to remember it all. No, it was the three that I mean, there are a lot of pitfalls, but the three
yeah,
I
because
saw.
we're kind of going back and forth towards, like you said, avoiding versus being virtuous in it. So,
That's right.
I mean,
Yep.
yeah.
So I think some of the pitfalls so one of the things that I found interesting, to step back for a second, of the book, and I know that, part of what you are doing here is also like, what's the takeaway? Like, what are we, and one of the takeaways, I think, for everybody.
I want people to want to be priests. I want people to want to revere celibacy. So if I give any other message, correct. That's
Right.
not what I'm trying to do.
Oh, no. And I think what I found helpful in the book was also realizing that a lot of the lessons that we need as priests and living our celibacy well and are also applicable to married men, and married women too, for that matter. But I mean, I'm just focusing on fatherhood now. In the sense, and because all of us really are called in some measure to spiritual fatherhood, right? And beginning with one's own personal children, biological children, right? I mean, men and women are called to be spiritual fathers and mothers to them, first of all, and helping them become citizens of the kingdom of God, helping them go to heaven, helping them become saints. And so in that sense, what I found really helpful is like seeing how so many of these lessons are actually applicable to everyone. And so some of these pitfalls that I looked at were things like, like activism, like where we just get into this approach to life where we can sort of really focus a lot on what we're doing and not who we are, and not sort of going a little bit deeper, and we can kind of skip along at the surface of life, and that can be deadly, I think, for any father. It can certainly be deadly for a priestly father, for a supernatural father. Narcissism, where this kind of this focus on self, where we're really more interested in, and we live in an age, a very prosperous age, and an age of kind of autonomy, which can be healthy, but it can also be disordered, where we really are often very much focused on ourselves. And so I think there can be some struggles with narcissism. Clericalism is an issue that I think is very prevalent today. I think it's always been prevalent. And part of it is, you had mentioned earlier that priests should be have a different expectation. We should have a different level. And I agree with you. We should have those expectations. When people are so upset, there's sometimes you hear, well, why are we so upset with the priests when, lay people are doing all these other things? Like, no, we should have a different standard.
Absolutely.
We should have that demanding standard for a priest. But at the same time, that can also kind of backfire sometimes if a man starts to imagine that he's on a different plane, not just in terms of his vocation, but actually himself, that he
pride,
sort of sees
ego,
himself.
Arrogance.
We can fall into that. And so that clericalism of kind of putting our ministry and our authority really above the fact that we're first of all disciples, right? And Jesus said we can't be like the pagans who lord it over each other, and that authority is supposed to be an authority in which he gave the example of washing the feet, and so that's, if a priest forgets that and he starts to focus on himself he becomes arrogant and kind of manipulative and all kinds of other things. So I try to look at those different pitfalls because, you want to look at the positive, but you also want to say, well, and these are some of the things that can really trip you up, and so that was kind of part of the reason for that whole section.
For those who are like watching or tuning later, only caught half the show, we're talking to my new friend, Father Carter Griffin, and we're talking about his book, Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest. Father, I want to go a little bit rabbit trail, but not really, because we're talking about chastity, continence, and something that every Catholic, I think, questions is then on the same line, why is masturbation considered a sin?
Well, I mean, I think at a very basic level, first of all, just to say that masturbation is the deliberate use of the sexual faculty to gratify ourselves for pleasure. And so I think that brings up the question, and so why do we have the sexual factor? Why do we have the capacity to have sex with another person? And for a Christian, that's not just a kind of a physical question, right? I mean, there's the obvious physical, biological question, that how these two human beings come together so they can, or two dogs or two pigs or whatever, to come together to produce another one of themselves.
Yeah, the natural.
The natural, right? And so that makes a lot of sense, right? The problem is this, that's not all that's going on when two human beings come together in a sexual act. What is also going on, in fact, we don't even call it reproduction, right? We call it procreation. Because what's going on is that those two human beings are cooperating with God, who enters into that union and produces something that neither of them is capable of doing, which is an immortal soul, right? They can, if we were reproducing, then it would somehow be just like a kind of a carbon copy of ourselves somehow, like it would be of two dogs. There's not the same, they are capable of producing a dog soul, and that's what they do. We are not capable of producing a brand new immortal soul. Only God can do that. And so that when two human beings engage in sexual activity, they are actually procreating. So that's the dignity, the beauty, the nobility of the human sexual act. So what we do with our sexual faculty is something that is not just a pure biological thing. It's something that has spiritual and moral overtones. And so we say that, any use of the sexual faculty should always be ordered, in as much as it's used, to sex within marriage, right? Between a husband and a wife. So without the husband and a wife bond, then children, are not going to be raised by their mother and father, which is part of God's plan. Obstructing that through contraception is a way of obstructing God's plan. If he wishes to give one of these beautiful children with an immortal soul, that would be a reason why contraception is not permissible. Masturbation is kind of similar in that respect. It's a sort of a frustration of God's plan for sexuality. So I think that at kind of the spiritual level, it's because we're, in a sense, telling a lie with our body. We're supposed to tell the truth. This is the whole idea of the theology of the body, is that we want to speak truthfully with our human acts, and by using our sexual drive for gratification rather than for what it's intended for, is in a sense robbing it of its deeper meaning. So that's at that level. But I would also say, just working as a priest with many people who have struggled with this, I've also seen over and over again how it really does lead to a kind of, because of those spiritual and moral truths, it leads to this very kind of inward focus. It leads, especially when it becomes habitual and over again, it's that inward turn in which we're using this
the self kind of, and not the God.
It really turns us, in fact, Augustine, whose feast day we have today, he had this great line where he called, he had a great way of understanding original sin, where he said, it's curvatus in se, turned in on ourselves. Like, that's the essence of original sin. And Jesus says the two great commandments are loving God and neighbor. Why? Because that's the opposite. It's turning out from ourselves towards God and towards neighbor. And masturbation hinders that, right? It turns us back inward.
Because I'm not looking at God and I'm not looking at neighbor. I'm looking at myself in that act.
My own sort of gratification and pleasure, and using this beautiful, powerful, noble faculty, basically, so that I can have a momentary high. And that might sound a little bit crude, but that's kind of what's going on.
That's what it is.
That's what it is, And so really, I think understanding at its deeper level and why it's something that it really doesn't make us happy in the long run, even in the short run. So often after doing it, people, I think, feel miserable about themselves, and they know that they've kind of cheated something. They've tried to get a shortcut to joy, and it hasn't given them joy.
What's really funny is on that same note, with the couples that I've worked with, and I say a man would just as soon have fingers on a chalkboard than to make love with a woman who doesn't care for him to be there. And we talk about that, saying, well, you're still getting an ejaculation, you're still having an orgasm, isn't that the same? And the men are like, no.
Mm.
If I don't feel as if that woman is loving me, respecting me, responding to me, wanting me and my humanness and my giving. So they said they don't feel as fulfilled, which is a really good example of what you just said, you know. So you could have the physical high, as you called
Right.
it. But we're made for more than that. When we're not
Right.
receiving that connection of ourselves with another person. So if I'm correct, mine would be with my husband, yours as a celibate priest would be with God. That, because I know I don't even have to ask you, you have to resist that temptation
Sure.
regularly,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you're still physiological, you still see beautiful women, and yet
Right.
to know when you resist and that this God loves you so much. Tell me, what are some of the greatest, you know, moments you've had with God through your celibacy?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I would say that, you know, the temptations that come to a priest would be very similar to the temptations of a married man, right? I mean, who, you know, over a period of time
Right.
has to still, be faithful to his wife, even when it's difficult, even when things get to be routine, even when they're quarreling, whatever it might be. So I think in that sense, this is where the virtue of chastity is so important. In fact, one of the things I tell seminarians who I help to form here is that for those who end up leaving formation because they've discerned that it's not their vocation, one of the best gifts they're going to give to their future wife, is really this self-mastery of chastity. And not just because, you know, natural family planning might take some discipline to where to live and things like that. It's just that capacity to know that you are in the battle and you're in the struggle, and that when, you know, the beautiful woman or the beautiful new secretary or whatever it might be, you know, enters into your life, that you still have enough command of yourself to be able to continue to have your heart entirely given to your wife. I mean, there are a few things that are more precious than that to a wife. There are a few things more precious than a husband. And so, yeah, I think so. Some of it is kind of the maybe a special connection to God through celibacy. I mean, it's the celibacy opens us up to that in a deeper way that, again, St. Paul talked about. And yeah, for sure, like I think one of the really beautiful things that I've experienced just as a priest is kind of seeing. I mean, we often don't see the fruit of our work. You know, I think God intends that to be the case. You know, we don't always have kind of the perfect, you know, knowledge of what we've done. I think maybe that would lead to pride or something like that. I don't know. But when he does lift the veil a little bit, and you're able to see the tremendous gratitude of people who have been you know, changed by my priestly ministry, and I'm fully aware that it's God who does it, and God who does it all. I mean, I don't have power over grace, but to know that I've been that instrument, I find those to be some of the deepest moments of consolation with the Lord. Just know, and I think every man, you mentioned manhood earlier. I mean, I think every man wants to feel like they are kind of accomplishing something, that they're doing something, that their life means something. I think every human being does, certainly. I think men have a particular a kind of a
Because
concrete
God,
approach to that.
yes,
You know,
yes. Well,
like
and
I
God
want to
built
know
you
that
into that, being the head of the family. Your brain is wired more differently than women, whose greater typical woman is empathy and compassion and, you know, connectedness. Men are like, I want to conquer, provide, including headship of this family, leadership. I want to provide all your needs,
right,
and in hopes to draw you closer
which
to
is an
God.
enormous achievement. You know, to be able to put a roof over the head of his family, to bring food home for his family, to be able to protect his family,
The sacrifice for them when
and
he
the
could be sitting
sacrifice for
home and
that.
going on
Right.
vacations and watching football all day.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm.
And with that, I know my life has meant something. It has made a difference in the world, and I can die now in peace. You know, and that sense of feeling like I have done something is something I think that celibacy has helped me to experience in very immediate ways. You know, in just kind of that interactive work with people. You know, with the seminarians that I have, with people at the parish before I came to the seminary. You know, so I think those would be some of the deepest. And then also just you know, you mentioned earlier kind of the logistical question, the time. I mean, just having time and having the capacity to make sure that I have time for prayer every day, which might not be possible for a married man. And so to have a regular habit of an hour typically of adoration, obviously Holy Mass, praying the Rosary, some spiritual reading, these different things that are kind of part of my life, which I recognize should be a part of really every Christian, every Catholic's life. But there's a kind of a privileged way of, I can put that first. You know, I can put God first in a way that, you know, sometimes it's going to be very difficult for a married man, let's face it. It can be difficult for a priest too, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But so I find that the time in prayer that I have, which I am just kind of able, you know, sometimes there's not a lot going on. There's not a lot of kind of fancy prayers or anything like that. It's just sitting with him, just being with him, and just kind of enjoying his presence. And I think he enjoying mine, has been maybe the most beautiful, kind of some of the most
Yeah.
beautiful moments of my life.
I was so envious of the priests when COVID separated us from Mass. I thought, oh, all those priests get to have Jesus every day, So one of the things that I'll just help you not take for granted, not saying that you have, but
Yeah.
For the sake of time, and this is, maybe you've answered this already, but I don't know if you have. So what would you say is, because I'm pro vocations, is the greatest thing you would tell someone discerning the priesthood? What has been one of the greatest things about being a priest?
Yeah. Wow. What do you choose from? I mean, I would say that the most beautiful thing that I have found about being a priest is the capacity that Jesus gives me the ability to make him present to his people. And I mean that in the sense of the Eucharist, but also just in myself, right? That people are able to hopefully encounter Jesus through me.
Yeah.
And I think that for a young man, what I have found is that these young men really want to, they want to make a difference in the world. They want to change the world. I mean, what young man doesn't? But to have that deep thirst for doing something great with your life, and to bring Jesus into the world. And I think these guys are growing up in a time where they see the darkness more and more clearly.
Yeah.
And I think they see kind of the struggles that the culture is having. They see the breakup of the family. They see the devastating wake of the sexual revolution, of which they are mostly victims. I mean, all of these things, they look around and they say, what can I do? And you could think, well, I could go and, become a counselor. Which is great work. I can go and become a statesman, and that's great work. I can go and be a teacher, and that's great work. All these things you can do. But how could you strike at some of that darkness most deeply? Where can you bring the light in most powerfully? And I can't imagine a better way than as being a priest. So being able to change the world, being able to change lives, and being able to do so in a way where you're bringing Jesus into the world and you are able to be Jesus for others, it doesn't get better than that. And it's a life full of joy. I mean, there's so much joy in this life. I can't tell you. And I think we see that even statistically. They've done these studies, and like priests are just off the charts in terms of their satisfaction with their life. We don't go into it for that reason per se. It's not like, oh, just come into this.
No,
and
but it's
everything will be easy.
Byproduct,
Yeah, it's a byproduct, exactly.
Yeah, I know. I'm almost done with the show for the sake of your time. I know you're a priest that has to go do your things, but I had Dr. Jessica McLeese on my show several times. She's a Christian sex therapist. And one of the analogies she gave, because we're talking about celibacy, is, let's assume every married man had sex 1 hour a day, every day of his marriage, which, let me just tell you, that ain't happening, right?
I can tell you that too.
Doesn't happen. Yeah, you talk to the guys. Well, let's assume that did. And I can't quickly do the math, but that's 1/24th of your day, right? So I don't know what percent that is. 1/24th of your life. What are you doing with the other 23/24ths? What is that? 99%, 90% of your time.
Right.
So if we focus so much on that one small but beautiful act, we're missing so much more. I mean, so that's my outsider's add to your book on celibacy. Okay, so can you do this? To me, masculinity is strength. And the strongest man is the man who is strong enough to overcome his physical tendencies.
Yeah, and I think, and of course, as you well know, as you know better than I, that it's really not even primarily about the sex as so much as it is the relationship. And that deep desire to have that connection with another person is a beautiful desire, and it's really in some ways the most important part of marriage, and sex is really supposed to be ordered to that, not the other way around, right? You don't have the relationship in order to have sex. You have sex, which is part of what helps unite the husband and the wife. And so I think what can be, in a sense, hardest about celibacy is not so much giving up the physical pleasure of sex, so much it is giving up that emotional intimacy of somebody with whom you walk through life together. And I think that's something that I try to be very, honest with the guys about that can be a real struggle. But where the joy comes in, and I think one of the reasons why priests can be so joyful is that when they live that celibacy well, they're in touch and they're in communion with so many other people in their lives. And in a very particular way, brother priests, that there is this deep bond of brotherhood and kind of brothers in arms, and just friends, deep friends who are experiencing and living the same kind of life together. So I think well lived, the celibacy of priesthood can be full of relationship. It doesn't replace the same kind. It's not the same thing. as a married relationship. There is a sacrifice,
A
as we
different
talked about
vocation,
earlier.
right?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I make a
But there's
sacrifice
also
to get
some,
married. I sacrifice
that's right.
ever the chance of being with any other man or any,
Exactly.
other things, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Father, finish the sentence. When I die, I will know I've made a difference if.
I would say I would know I've made a difference if people that I've served as a priest are closer to Jesus, and because they're closer to Jesus, they also want to be with Jesus forever in heaven. I feel like if there's a real lack, I think, of kind of a supernatural outlook, in the world, and a supernatural tone, and to have increased the spiritual temperature a little bit, so that people see the seriousness of this life, and to see that this life is not intended to end here, but is intended to end in heaven. And if they're praying for me, because they have more of a supernatural outlook, and they are themselves really desiring to become saints and to live forever in heaven, if there are 5 souls or 10 souls, or even 1 soul who is closer to that because I've lived, then I think I'll be happy with the life that I've lived. I feel like I will have accomplished something very beautiful because it's eternal.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that everyone can aspire to. That idea of when we say we want to leave the world better than we found it, I think fundamentally that means, have we left the world in such a way that more people wish to go to heaven, and know how to do it and know how to get there. And that, because there's nothing, this world will end. All of us will die, and the world itself will end. And yet after that, that life will continue. And if we're not thinking about that and looking to that, then we've missed something along the way.
We missed the whole point.
Yeah.
We've missed the whole point. One more fill in the blank. Name one thing you'd have our listeners do differently as a result of something they heard today.
Well, I think priests are going through a hard time right now too, in the midst of this pandemic. And it's true, we have the grace of having been able to celebrate the sacraments all throughout but there's also a feeling that, many people are not coming back to church. And there's a feeling of like, gosh, how far back have we stepped? How far back have we regressed? And I think priests always need their support and the encouragement of the people, and the prayer of the people that they serve. And so my hope is that with the renewed, maybe a deeper appreciation for the beauty of celibacy, that people will be sort of informed in such a way that they can express gratitude to their priest for the sacrifice that he's made, because the sacrifice is really for them. It's for the people that we serve. That's what gives meaning to our life. It's what gives meaning to the life of any mother and father, in a certain sense, of like giving life to their children. And so it's why we exist, and to have people, sort of acknowledge that. And not that we're in it for the gratitude, but to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it.
Because we all need cheerleaders.
We do. We need encouragement. All of us do. We're human beings, and to have that, to appreciate the celibacy, and therefore to be able to thank the priests in that way, with a greater understanding, I think would be a tremendous gift.
You know what you just said. So the book I set out to discover, is super extreme happiness accidental? Was a formula? Basically, did people just happen to marry the right person, or was there? Yeah. Did they do the right things? I did find a formula. The formula was sacred, SACRED. And Father, do you know that I've learned that the same things that make you a super husband or a super wife is the same thing that makes you a super customer service rep or a super leader. So let me quick tell you the formula, because you've just touched on it, and you made me realize it makes you a super priest as well. Sacred, selflessness. The most extremely happy couples, extremely happy priests are the ones who give more than take.
Right.
The A is attentiveness. Do you pay attention to that which is negative and poor, their flaws, or do you pay attention to that which is good and the better parts? C is communication. I don't have to go into that. We all understand that. R is respect. E is encouragement. Super husbands are extremely encouraging of their wives, and vice versa. And as you just said, we priests need encouragement. Say, Father, I appreciate your sermons. I appreciate you writing this book. I appreciate what you're sacrificing. And the D shows our humanness, is deliberateness. I have to deliberately remember. I told Father I'd pray for him. So and actually, so I've had a couple priests in my life, and I told them I'd put them on a bead. So even though I might call you Griffin Carter, Father Carter Griffin, God knows who you are, and I'll put you here. And may he bless you in your striving towards getting other young men and women into the vocation.
Well,
So
thank you so much,
God
Christine. It's been
bless
such a
you.
joy to get to know you as well. Thank you. Thanks
Well,
for
I
having me on.
appreciate it. So before we go off the air, I want to remind my viewers that your book is called Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest. Father, where can I get that book from?
It's from Emmaus Road Publishing, so you can purchase it directly from Emmaus Road, which is part of St. Paul's Center, which is run by Scott Hahn and that wonderful group of people. It's also available on Amazon.
I was just going to say, I found it on Amazon. So if you forget, just boom, go there.
Right.
And if you forget that, just go to my website, breakfastwithbacon.com. You'll see this show, all the other shows. I've had great men and women. I'd encourage you to share this show. There might be someone in your life who you're praying for who even isn't articulating that they're discerning the priesthood, but I think we civilians need to get a better idea of this celibacy in the priesthood. And let's face it, the young men out there that are, discerning. So
Yes,
share this, go take a look at the other shows. Let's bring people to the kingdom. That's exactly what I'm trying to do by doing these shows. I want to answer that question saying, I will know I'm a success, that when I die, the Lord looks at me and says, well done, good and faithful servant. You've saved 1 million marriages. That's my own personal vocation. So Father, you have been a blessing to me. Would you mind coming back on again, talking about some other priestly topic or
be
Catholic
delighted
topic?
to. Yeah.
Oh, I would love it. Okay, so I'm going to put these back on because I have to hit some buttons here. And we're going to end in the way I end all of my shows. I am Dr. Christine Bacon. You've been listening and watching Breakfast with Bacon, and I want to remind you always to live your life sunny side up.